Good afternoon. My name is Whitney Aaron Basil, and on behalf of the entire Theorizing the Web Organizing Committee, I'd like to welcome you to today's episode of Theorizing the Web Presents, Bad Company. Theorizing the Web Presents is our new lecture series about technology and society. New episodes will stream live every other Wednesday at 2 p.m. Eastern, and we'll also announce some special events coming up later this fall. If you'd like to discuss today's episode in real time, or to submit questions for Q&A, you can join us in the TTW Discord. You can find the Discord back channel by following the link in the description of this YouTube video or on our website, theorizingtheweb.org. Before we get started, I would like to thank the production team at the Museum of the Moving Image, without whom Theorizing the Web Presents truly would not be possible. I'd also like to thank my fellow organizing committee members and all three of today's panelists. On behalf of all of us, we'd like to thank you for watching and participating. If you like today's talk and you want to see more, please consider making a donation to both Theorizing the Web and Museum of the Moving Image. Every donation helps us to produce content like this, and we're grateful that we can do this with you. And with that, I will turn it over to today's moderator, Dr. Apryl Williams. Apryl is Assistant Professor of Communication and Media at the University of Michigan and a faculty fellow at Harvard University's Berkman Klein Center for Internet and Society. Her research focuses on emerging technologies, digital media, and race relations in digital spaces. Thank you, Apryl.
Thank you, Whitney. I'm very excited for today's episode, Bad Company. I think it's going to be a really great conversation about sort of the internet and corporatization more broadly and what that means for all of us. We have sort of two different case studies that are going to delve into it a little bit more in depth. And I don't want to take away from the things that they're going to say, so I'm going to keep it short today and start by introducing our first speaker, Elinor. So Elinor Carmi is a feminist, researcher, journalist, and digital rights advocate who has been working on deviant media, internet standards, sound studies, and internet governance for the past decade. Her second book, Media Distortions, Understanding the Power Behind Spam, Noise, and Other Deviant Media, was recently published on Peter Lang Press and is open access. Elinor will be presenting Ordering the Antisocial, How the Advertising Industry Orders Your Mediated Experience.
Great. Thank you, everybody. And thanks you so much for Theorizing the Web and the Museum for Moving Image for having me. And let me just share my screen. Wait. Great. So I hope everybody can see this okay on their screens. So today I'm basically going to talk about a portion of my book. So if you kind of want to understand what I'm talking about a bit better, where I go to sort of focus more in the finer details of the resolution, please check out my book. I have a website that is dedicated to it. It's open access. So you can sort of understand a bit more what I'm talking about. But in a nutshell, what I'm talking about is media power. And I think that when we talk about media power, most of the time, most of the theories and sort of the theoretical approaches that people think through are through vision and sort of visual concepts. So probably one of the most famous visual concept is Michel Foucault's Panopticon, and another these kind of other terms that we often use and often scholars use is invisibility, vision, transparency, seeing, and black box. And what I realized when I was working on my project, when I was trying to understand deviant media categories, was that actually when we're thinking about these kind of power relations, there are these kind of multiplicities. And I realized that actually vision doesn't really allow us to think about these kind of multiple actors, multiple spaces, multiple times, multiple purposes. And what sound allows us is this kind of breaking of boundaries, because sound allows us to go through one space and another and be in sort of multiple spaces at the same time. So and of course, I also come from, I used to work in the music industry. So I think that for me, thinking through music or sound was very natural. And I think that it helped me understand what I'm exploring better. So my theory is very much inspired by several theories. I'm not going to go into that very deep at the moment. Again, if you want to check it out in my book, you will see what I mean there. I'm influenced by media theory, science and technology studies, software studies, feminist technoscience, critical legal studies, and of course, sound studies. So I mainly work with two main concepts that I've developed. One of them is processed listening, which is a mode of listening whereby practitioners who can come from different professions and interests listen to different kind of sources by using several tools in different times to produce different kind of knowledges for similar purposes. And when I talk about knowledge, I basically mean different kind of profiles. So I'm very much relying on the history of science and sort of knowledge production, the politics of knowledge production, but I use sound concept to understand that. And the complementary concept that I use that is influenced by rhythm analysis of Henry Lefebvre and also Raymond Williams' planned flow is what is actually done. So when actually companies, I'm going to talk about it more in the case study, but when these companies produce deep profiles, what do they actually do with this knowledge? And with Earth Media, what I talk about is the way that they reorder different kind of components and orchestrate different kind of rhythms, which is that they allow different kind of sociality while filtering out problematic rhythms, which I call spam. And hopefully with the case study that I'm going to show you, it's going to be a bit more clear. So I'm talking about the early 2000s when the digital advertising industry wanted to standardize how they measure people's behavior. So after the dot-com bubble crash, a lot of companies, a lot of digital advertising companies had a lot of different kind of methods to measure a different kind of behaviors. And because they wanted to make the transition from subscription business model into the exploitative business model that we know today, they wanted to have these kind of specific metrics that would make sense to all of these companies together. So the IAB, which is the Interactive Advertising Bureau, did this kind of study where they wanted to standardize how they understand people's behavior on the internet. So as you can see here, I was analyzing their documents and also different kind of documents where they were lobbying the IETF, which I'm going to show you shortly, which is the Internet Engineering Task Force, and also lobbied the European Union. So here what we can see is part of their kind of metrics and which kind of metrics they wanted to standardize and to understand and to have like a unifying way to measure that. And here what we can see is that one of the biggest standards, so the most substantial standard that they wanted to standardize, which was cookies. Now, most of the time when people talk about cookies, they call it just a text file. And what I talk about in my research, that actually web cookies are a form of communication. And what we can see here with this seemingly boring standard is that when you type a specific website, you get in the backend, which I'm going to talk about it shortly, multiple cookies that are sent into your computers and to your computer. And what they have done with this standard is that they made it legal and legitimate. So with cookies, basically, companies can actually listen to your behavior in multiple spaces. That means that if I'm surfing several websites, or if I'm on Facebook, or if I'm on Twitter, and if I'm several places, they can understand my behavior in multiple places, in multiple times. So for example, if I'm browsing today, if I'm browsing tomorrow, through a continuous time, they're collecting a lot of my patterns of behavior throughout time in order to create a profile, which then is sold and traded. So as I said, cookies are a bulk communication that is conducted between non-human actors, which could be the browsers and the publishers or advertisers. They talk with each other on predefined topics, which is, for example, my gender, my age, which kind of pages I'm looking at, how much time am I investing in, for example, a specific web page, and so on and so forth. And when we're talking about cookies, we're of course talking about dozens, if not hundreds of cookies that are sent to your computer in a specific moment. One of the other things that they wanted to understand is because there's so much different kind of behaviors online, a lot of it is actually non-human behavior. And so what they wanted to understand is which kind of behavior is the human behavior in order that they can actually have some kind of value from it, meaning that they actually needed to make a distinction between human behavior and non-human behavior so that they can have these kind of profiles. So what they did actually was trying to understand which kind of behaviors are more human and which kind of behaviors are more robotic in order to make this kind of distinction and to know what to measure and what not to measure. And in doing so, they created these kind of different categories and standards of what is a normal human behavior on the internet and what is not. So this kind of non-human behavior would be, for example, users who are performing multiple sequential activities, users with high level of activities, users who act in consistent interaction attributes, and different kind of other measurements. Another thing that the advertising industry did was to lobby the European Union in order to legitimize cookies. So I don't know if you can see this. This is part of the e-privacy directive that was approved in 2002. And what they basically say there is that actually cookies are sort of that they can send cookies to people's computers, even though it's their private spheres, because it's for a legitimate purpose. And by doing that, they basically legitimize the whole exploitative business model and the kind of what other platforms are doing, such as Facebook and so on. This is where it all began. This is how it was standardized in the European Union. And as you can see here, these are articles from the 90s. And so I'm reading here about the battle that was around cookies. And as you can see here, Danny Meadow-Clue, the chairman of the IAB in the United Kingdom, said that cookies have been branded as spyware tools or some kind of subversive software, but it's what we use every day. And with these kind of claims, they were basically saying, well, we actually use that all the time. So, so it's legitimate, even though back then already people knew that this is kind of spyware where they are spying over our behavior over time and creating profiles, even though we don't even know that is happening in the back end. So when I'm talking about this back end, I basically talk about this kind of ecosystem that is real-time bidding, which is a standard that was later on sort of developed further by Facebook. What Facebook is doing is a different form of real-time bidding, where different kind of entities, multiple companies, for example, publishers, advertising companies, ad networks, and things like that, they can basically bid on specific profiles, on specific audiences, in order to present different kind of messages in a specific time and in a specific space, according to how much money you can offer for that. So basically what I'm saying is that when I'm talking about this kind of power relation and when I'm talking about sound is the fact that the more companies can listen to you, the more that they can create these kind of profiles on you. So for example, Facebook has the most listening capacities because it can spy on you in multiple spaces. And companies that work with Facebook, for example, have lesser listening capacities, but they can still understand your behavior in different spaces. And what was the problem at that time is that with this kind of standard of cookies, the advertising industry made us not see what is happening, not listen to what's happening in the back end. So actually a lot of people, now we know about it a bit more, but throughout the 2 decades almost that these standards were sort of legitimized, we had this kind of specific interface that hid a lot of the stuff that's happening in the back end. If you live in Europe, you probably know all of these useless buttons that sort of give you control, and you can sort of maybe say, oh, okay, I approve about cookies, but we actually don't really understand what's happening in the back end. And this is also part of the advertising industry lobbying mechanism where they didn't want us to see what's happening in the back end and to understand that we will understand that we are being traded and that the kind of information that we see, the kind of engagement that we have with other people is a resolution as a sort of the conduct of these kind of mechanism that's happening behind your screen. So this is from South Park. If you didn't see that season, I really recommend you. And there they basically show you how these kind of advertisements are chasing you all over the web. And I think it's a really great way to finish my talk. So I hope that you understood what I was talking about, these kind of power relations through sound. And I thank you very much. And I'm looking forward to your questions in the Q&A. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Elinor. That was
Yes.
great. I'm also looking forward to Q&A. I have some questions myself. But for now, we'll proceed and head to Adam. So Adam Willems studies religion and economy at Union Theological Seminary. They are the author of Divine Innovation, a newsletter on the spiritual world of technology. Their work also appears in outlets like The Appeal, Religion News Service, and The Rumpus. They'll be presenting Can We Call a Startup a Cult?
Thank you, April. Just sharing my screen. There we go. So yes, thank you again, April. Thank you to Theorizing the Web and to Museum of the Moving Image. Hello, I hope this message finds you well. Welcome to my presentation called Can We Call a Startup a Cult? After a brief overview / autobiography concerning how I arrived at the question of this talk, we'll get our feet wet for a bit. It's a new Zoom feature. And then we'll mull over the social and political power of the term cult. And then, cherry on top, we'll contemplate what that means for the tech industry and for theorizing the web in general. So about myself, my favorite topic, I write Divine Innovation, a newsletter on the spiritual world of technology. So, comment, like, subscribe. And I also study religion and economy at Union Theological Seminary in New York City. But before entering this religious area of study, I worked at a fintech startup in Delhi, India. I'm not a notably religious person, like I'm a Virgo, but almost every aspect of my work for this Delhi startup felt incredibly religious. There was constant talk of missions and conversions and impact and angel investors, which was language that felt perfectly at home in a startup, but totally out of place in what would be called a small business. The founders had also crafted a founding myth that proved that they were doing good work, and that added weight to their demands for cult-like respect and dedication. But beyond the religious language and myth-making that was at play, the rituals at this startup were what felt most uncanny to me. We as a company celebrated employee arrivals and birthdays with the exact same energy and rituals that we did explicitly religious holidays like Diwali or Christmas. Where religion ended and office culture began felt incredibly murky, and that felt like a feature rather than a bug. So I saw the startup I worked at as an actual cult. It had a founding myth. It wanted to grow and convert others at any cost. It considered itself countercultural, at least in relation to the Indian regulatory landscape, which is hot, I guess. And it had a cult of personality around its leadership. I extrapolated from that data point of 1 to contend that the startup as a corporate form was a cult, and as it grew, it would become a religion. But the wrinkle to the concern in question is that startups aren't cults. In fact, nothing is a cult. This is a history that is under-discussed, harmful, and continuing today. But this doesn't mean that we should throw the baby out with the bathwater and stop the investigation there. We can look at what gets called a cult and what doesn't. That can help us better understand what political projects are advanced through religious language and grapple with what religious beliefs and practices exist in supposedly secular institutions. Though national context obviously means that this history diverges a lot, I'll focus here on the United States instead of India, where that fintech startup was. And as a result, I'll primarily cite American scholars. In part, this is because of tech's location and power within this country and how it expands outward from here. The history of the term cult and its use, especially in the United States, is one of state violence, white and Christian supremacies, and conservatism. For one, Megan Goodwin, who is a scholar of American minority religions, posits that groups that are deemed too free, too different, too transgressive end up being called cults. And perhaps unsurprisingly, what is seen to stray too far from the orbit charted out for religion is demographically determined. In the United States, religious groups with purchase among queer people, among women, among Black people, and Indigenous people are more likely to not be called real religions in the eyes of the state. Being marked for their surveillance then invites, being marked for their difference, then invites them to then be surveilled and eliminated by the state. And it deflects accountability away from other sites of abuse and harm. For the sake of time, I won't dive into the full history of the use of cult as a tool of white supremacist state intervention and elimination. Maybe perhaps unsurprisingly, it's a very long history. But I recommend reading Catherine Jin Lum and Lerone A. Martin's essay, American Religion and the Rise of Internal Security, which is in this book. And there is very conveniently another essay found just 130 pages later that is called The FBI and the Nation of Islam by Carl Evans. I'll chart a trajectory from these two essays that speak to a larger trend. The FBI was concerned with policing race through religion since its genesis in 1908 in the post-Reconstruction era. The largest Black parallel institutions of the post-Plessy versus Ferguson era were religious groups. Jin Lum and Martin write, the emergence of autonomous Black religious communities came to be seen as a threat to the nation's internal security. This Black Protestant establishment amounted to the largest and most influential force in a segregated Black America. Taking shape in the same period as the Black Protestant establishment, the nascent Bureau of Investigation would soon learn that it needed to engage Black America through its faith communities. That J. Edgar Hoover then used the Nation of Islam's quote unquote fanatic nature to apply for technical surveillance is not a coincidence. Nor is it a coincidence that subsequent press leaks under COINTELPRO called the Nation of Islam a cult, which added a moral impetus to the group's government-sponsored disarray and collapse. The later ascent of the anti-cult movement, meanwhile, which is a collective of conservative Christian groups, brought increased attention and validity to brainwashing theory. For the record, it's pseudoscience and borrows heavily from a 1960s film called The Manchurian Candidate, which, if you can't tell by its name, is a very Orientalist movie about a communist sleeper agent tasked with assassinating a US senator. So in general, don't use the term brainwashing. It's kind of shitty and shallow, honestly. Brainwashing argues that people don't join non-normal religious groups willingly and are therefore movements that require abusive practices to grow and survive. The anti-cult movement has now largely moved away from this kind of brainwashing language, but it continues to pathologize other religious movements and invite their elimination. Doing so makes anti-cultist religious beliefs seem normal and worthy of state support. So checkpoint, pause. Where are we now in the presentation? First, I hoped my message found you well. I gave a little biography. I went through whether startups are cults or not, and I answered no because of the history of how cult is used and weaponized, particularly against minoritized groups. So where does this leave us, and what can we do with this knowledge and trajectory? For one, we can compare how the state approaches tech startups and corporations and ask why, despite their many cult-like values and practices, they are not subjected to surveillance like the Nation of Islam was, or to violent raids like what took place in Waco. I think few institutions point to this hypocrisy as glaringly as Facebook does. Facebook's muscled introduction to millions of users in Myanmar fueled disinformation and a genocide against Rohingya Muslims. Facebook employees worked in service of the company's mission and did whatever it took to accomplish it. They, quote, give people the power to build community and bring the world closer together, no matter what the cost of that is. Why was Facebook allowed to parachute into Myanmar as an American corporation, rearrange the social fabric as it saw fit, and do so without any accountability whatsoever? For one, an institution's ambitions in the name of innovation and profit bring government support rather than surveillance. Startups and tech companies can be cult-like in their countercultural rhetoric and aesthetics and engage in very brutal practices, but they can remain viable by serving larger state projects like wealth accumulation and expansion of empire by corporate proxy. The history of Christianity also speaks to how a religion can grow from being a cult to something that is in partnership with empire. In the case of early Christianity, it was the Roman Empire that made the group no longer a cult, but a rapidly growing religion. And this comparative exercise and thinking of empire in particular adds an additional lens to the history laid out in From Counterculture to Cyberculture by Fred Turner, which in general tries to chart this biography and history of how we reach the kind of mix of nerdiness and commune-like vibes that we get in startups today. So it's not just that what we would now call startup culture is a marriage of World War II research center innovation culture with the kind of commune culture that we saw coming from, kind of the back to the land movement of the 1960s and 70s. Commune culture could viably enter this hybrid tech form because the military researchers and their traditions also came with enduring military ties and state support. Where cults and startups thus diverge is this military institutional form and ambition. But the other core component is that by and large, it's not just that the tech industry lacks the demographics that would historically invite cult-like scrutiny from the state. Many of the technologies invented in the Silicon Valley ecosystem are literally eugenic, or at the least, they amplify the eugenic practices that already exist in society at large. And they enforce racial hierarchies that the state perpetuates through other means. There are clear examples like Clearview, the facial recognition system, Axon, the inventor of the taser, and Google's Project Maven, which is AI for drones. Oh my God. But other technologies less immediately related to incarceration and warfare reward a proclivity to share personal information and to self-brand. They make self-optimizing a valuable practice. They render biometrics normal. They mark certain aesthetics and kinds of beauty as superior to others. They reinforce stereotypes and hierarchies of intelligence. The tip of the iceberg here are things like Facetune and the content moderation of social media outlets. So to drive it home, we can't call tech startups and corporations cults because they are engaging in the kinds of policing that make other groups become labeled cults in the first place, and they get targeted for elimination. They're in many ways above the law because they are being supported by the state as a way to replace the religious institutions that once policed race in the first place. So from there, there's the question of biometrics for sure. And then there's the question of kind of like, just what do we do from here? How can we police and regulate the tech industry if it itself is competing and part of just this entire political, racializing, carceral practice of empire? And actually maybe here, my background as a seminarian can be useful for proposing policy interventions. At least that's what I hope. So enter embedded theologies. Stone and Duke coined this term in 1996 in their book, How to Think Theologically. An embedded theology is almost pre-intentional, they argue. It is embedded theology that rushes to the front line in every battle over the moral and social issues of the day. These two authors are thinking about the ways that churches embed their theologies into their members. But the term, I would argue, also applies to other truth disseminating institutions and how these truths appear in moments that invite gut responses. Crucially, at least how I learned the term, embedded theologies are informed by the morals and messages passed on to us as we grow up. So thinking of technologies and the cultural values of tech startups and kind of the values inflected within those products, the question of informed consent certainly comes up. But then also just the question of how technology is used and also just its sheer presence. Conditioning through technologies like smart devices and educational systems bring truth with a capital T into a technology's ubiquity. and it brings a tendency to push for self-optimizing and more efficient systems over time. It digs itself a virtuous hole that becomes increasingly entrenched, normal, and a moral good over time. So with that kind of alarm, it's at least at first glance reassuring that politicians in increasing numbers are calling something like Clearview or Facebook or Google or Amazon an evil. But cult as a foil drives home that politicians supposedly keeping the tech industry in check are actually doing very little without efforts to rein in the military-industrial complex. Practices of empire and the carceral state contracted through and rendered efficient by the tech industry continue, regardless of things like antitrust regulation and CEO depositions. So sitting with startup equals cult as an equation, a metaphor, a sandwiching has brought this presentation many places. My feet are wet, and I hope yours are too. There are certainly overlaps between what belongs to the tech industry and what triggers righteous, Christian, pearl-clutching religious panic from the state and others. We've walked through some of the history of how cult is used as a term, considered the role of empire, eugenics, and the military in shielding the tech industry from greater cultist scrutiny, and thought about what the theological power of tech startups, corporations, and their products does over time. But I hope that to throw a little technology phrase into the mix, we can all think about rebooting our religiously inflected language, turning it off and back on again. I'm still clearly in the process of rebooting my own thought processes. I spent 2 years hell-bent, so to speak, on analyzing startups as cults without understanding the history and implications of how cult as a term is wielded. I'm still working through how the histories I've learned can be useful in popular approaches to the encroachments and stubbornness of tech and empire. The political power of religious language is hidden much more successfully than any of the blemishes kind of masked through that Zoom touch-up feature. And it's definitely not easy to unpack. So I'd love for working through these questions to be a collaborative and collective process. So with that in mind, I'm very grateful in advance for your questions and critiques, and thank you everyone for listening.
Thank you, Adam. That was great. And please, Elinor, if you will join us for the Q&A portion.
Yes.
I'm very excited to sort of kick off our question and answers. So the thing that strikes me that is in common, or that's common to both of your work, is how really both of you are speaking to this idea that different social forces influenced or allowed a sort of tech pervasiveness, whether that be from surveillance or generally just accepting tech practices, both at the corporate level and at the individual level as users. So I'm wondering if you could speak, both of you could speak a little bit about how we got to this point. What allowed this sort of environment to become so pervasive and so widely accepted by the general user?
So who should start?
Whoever wants to start.
Elinor, you can go first if you want.
Okay, good. So I think for me, what's really important to emphasize is that, and this is, I think, why I always started with the early 2000s, is that I think a lot of people sort of brush that history and forget that the lobbying efforts are extremely important in understanding how we understand the web. So what I was talking about before, when different kind of programmers were offering the web cookies standard, one of the things that they said is that actually, you know, people should see what's happening in the back end. So they offered that, you know, the standard way that we would see the web through the browser would be that you would have sort of like if you have the privacy badger, for example, that you can see, you know, the dozens cookies. And then the advertising industry lobbied and said, oh, no, it's going to confuse people and blah, blah, blah. And that's why we get these kind of clean interfaces where we don't see what's happening in the back end. So I think a lot of the problems that we experience today has to do with these kind of lobbying efforts of the digital advertising industry through different kind of avenues. As I said, it was both, the Internet Standards Organization, also legal organizations such as the European Union. So I'm always wondering, like, if they wouldn't have succeeded, if we would have experienced the web and we would see what's happening in the back end, maybe we would understand, a bit more some of these things. Now, when I'm talking about this lobbying, it's also about what we're educated about, right? Like most people, I was teaching advertising students, most of them didn't even know how web cookies work. So I think, there's a huge gap in the literacy of people to understand what's actually happening. And it's an ongoing effort of the advertising industry and other industries to sort of have us experience this in a specific way and to create this kind of power relations.
Yeah, and I think also related to that is like that there certainly was investment from industry, so something like advertising, to make these very clean interfaces, but at the same time thinking about not just the genesis of the internet as something that took place in a military environment, but also thinking about how a company like Google was able to grow in the first place. And that comes in a post 9/11 space in which having access to that, just plenty of surveillance, of like just almost like limitless resources for them to comb through, is something that made Google as a product and a business system not only viable, but conducive to this kind of almost like Moore's law growth over time. So it's like, the CIA has a VC wing. And I think like that's a thing that like still exists, and that's astounding to me, but not astounding at the same time. And so even if, there's not this like cabal of, ad agency executives and like Pompeo hanging out in a room together, thinking about how to structure the internet, they're all incentivized at the very least to keep the status quo and to make things more automagical and conducive to surveillance over time.
Yeah, absolutely. And my next question is sort of a follow-up to that one. How do you both think that we can sort of move away from it or sort of break free? Like, I feel that there's this cycle that we're sucked into, and it's really hard to take a step back from that, especially as we're talking about sort of the larger cultural structure that's readily embraced this deep, like romantic relationship with internet technologies. How do we get away from that? How do we stop the cycle?
I'll take the mic if it's okay. I think that we need to stop thinking about it as a singular solution and start working in multiple areas. So the areas that I think that would be the most productive are three main areas. One is to create other business models that are not reliant on advertising and selling us and trading us. The other one would be creating different kind of legal structures that make it illegal to do what they're doing, because it's basically like trading people. And the third thing would be to educate. So what I'm working on now is basically data literacies, and I think that sort of creating these kind of educational material for people to actually understand what's happening in the back end, not only to be programmers, but really understanding, and also understanding that things could be different and it doesn't have to be in the way that they are now, I think is paramount. So I think these kind of three avenues, and working with kind of, grassroots organizations, it can't only be top down, it has to be bottom up as well. So that's what I think should happen.
Yeah, and I think speaking of that bottom up kind of grassroots question, I think also what would make a more holistic solution that felt more sustainable and structural would be for there to be explicit solidarity and coalitions between kind of tech labor organizers and anti-war organizing. I think those are two kind of spaces that don't necessarily speak to each other constantly. I mean, there have been overlaps like something like Project Maven, but there still needs to be kind of a space of like really telescoping out and thinking about like the fact that Silicon Valley as a space has immense geopolitical consequence and is a space of immense harm.
Absolutely. Yeah. Thank you both for those very well thought out responses. So my next question, and then we'll sort of move on to more general questions from the viewing audience. I'm thinking a little bit about COVID because it's something that's always on all of our minds, of course. So I'm wondering if you could both talk about how this increased either invited or uninvited surveillance due to COVID impacts your work and the way that you're sort of thinking about the questions that you're thinking about.
I think personally for me, it didn't really influence me in terms of more surveillance. I'm doing just research, so I'm not teaching, so I didn't have to deal with all of these things. I think for me, one of the annoying thing was that, again, there is this kind of, my university didn't even ask us. They're like, oh, you're going to use Zoom, right? So I think part of these things, and I know that I can talk about the UK experience, that there were several attempts by academics also that sort of wanted to push back on Microsoft being our main mail, instrument, for example. So I think this kind of reliance on big companies is a mistake by academics, I think. And a lot of it has to do because, it's just too much money or different kind of things like that. And I think that academics should definitely lead the way into thinking about alternative ways, because it's completely unsafe and we need to sort of set examples for our students and to create this kind of higher standards for which companies we want to collaborate with and which kind of companies are the standards of our communication. And I think that should be where we start to think about these things. And then it sort of leaps into other issues. That's my experience.
To take it in a totally different direction, is since the start of COVID, I've seen increasing use of the term cult used against, especially, I would say, fringe or even just like mainstream right-wing factions within the US body politic. I've seen people refer to the Trump administration as Branch Covidian, which is a riff on Branch Davidian, which owned that compound in Waco. I've seen a lot of people, including the Columbia Journalism Review, refer to QAnon as a cult. And then there's just been constant kind of discourse surrounding kind of public health responses in the United States, creating a death cult in the US, essentially. And it really seems like what the question to be asked is, first of all, those groups aren't calling themselves religious, they aren't calling themselves cults. You have to think about self-identity here, but that almost like matters way less than just the question of like, what are you accomplishing by saying that something is like irrational or unprecedented or otherworldly, instead of thinking about the fact that like public health interventions in the US, the way that they've totally atrophied and the way that we've seen in the past 6 months isn't just a product of the Trump administration. It's also just a product of like violently leeching privatized healthcare. It's the product of decades and centuries of racialized practices of eugenics being something that exists in the US government and isn't spoken of. And so I think just for me, it's been like a thing of like just seeing cult and thinking about and peeling back those layers of like what's happening, who wins almost when you use that kind of terminology.
Absolutely. And that's actually a great segue into our audience questions. And the first one is for Adam. And it's around the idea of the terminology of cult. So if cult is an effective rhetorical weapon to discredit groups, then maybe cults don't qualify as cults now, but maybe we should wield the term cult as a weapon against these companies. What do you think about that?
I have been very tempted. There have definitely been moments where I've thought, well, what if we just stopped using cult as a term for religious groups and flipped it on its head and used it explicitly for groups that don't call themselves religious, but engage in those practices that I mentioned before, myth making, growth at any cost, conversion, blah, 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 blah. But again, it's kind of a thing of like, that then makes you center in on the tree instead of the forest. And you don't think about, for one, the policies that let something like that exist in the first place. Like, sure, Elon Musk feels like a cult leader, but then there's the question of like lithium ion batteries and the fact that the United States has helped foment a coup in the past, year and a half, basically just for like a supply chain, right? That's not a cult, that's just empire. And I think there's kind of this thing of like, it's definitely tempting, but the way that cult has been used as a white supremacist tool makes it irredeemable. And it also just makes the magnifying glass make us short-sighted, essentially.
Yeah, that's very interesting. I hadn't thought about it from that perspective. So Elinor, you talked about how companies structure our experiences of being online, while Adam talked more about the underlying ideologies that structure companies. Putting the two together, how do the ideologies within companies sort of trickle down to user experiences in ways that we may not realize?
I think that we sort of do realize them, especially scholars, when it comes to, content moderation and the kind of things that you engage with. So a project that I'm working on now, which is sort of expanding on my book, is about personalization. And I think in all of my projects, I like to sort of pick on concepts that we sort of think that we know everything about them, but actually when we unpack them, we sort of understand that we don't know a lot about them. So that, started with spam. And now I'm looking at personalization. And I think personalization is exactly this kind of ideology that you're talking about, because, technically they say, oh, we love personalization, but actually we don't really have any other choice of experiencing the internet and the web, because that's the only way that we can experience it. And that is the only way that, these companies can actually make money from. So personalization is a way for them to sort of sell us, oh, this is the kind of experience that you want. And it's with this kind of experience, they can create profiles and these kind of things. But they sell us that this is the best way, but we can't actually compare, because we can't really know what is a non-personal experience. So, and in the back end, all of the stuff that they're doing. So for example, with that project, I'm analyzing Facebook correspondence in the leaked documents of 643, which was an app that is suing Facebook now about how they changed their API in 2015. And basically what you can see there is this kind of negotiation of, what will actually people like? When they were starting to think about which kind of business model they would like, and they said, oh, we're just going to sell them this kind of personalization. And with time, they're going to, grow to love it. And I think this is this kind of ideology of like, which I think is very much Steve Jobs kind of thing. We're just going to give them like one way to experience thing. And at the end of the day, they would like it and they would think that this is the only way. So to me, this is, personalization is a way to think about how this ideology comes into practice, because we are supposedly have all the options that we want, but technically we just have personalization, and that sort of feeds into their business model. I hope that answered that.
Yeah, absolutely. Adam, do you want to respond to that question as well?
It makes me think of two things. One, Kate Wagner had a great article come out, I think last year or a year and a half ago, in the Baffler about kind of the aesthetics of the early internet, with that like, welcome to my website kind of aesthetic, and that really like bred so much freedom on the internet, and like not like a libertarian way necessarily, but more just like, that people had that kind of agency to craft what their internet experience both felt and looked like. And it seems almost like Facebook has made this guardrail where over time, your daily practice within this very monolithic, boring corporate white and blue framework feels like natural and feels like unquestioned over time for a lot of people, at least. Maybe not for people who, historicize the internet or theorize the web, but I think definitely for the everyday user, it becomes something unquestioned and normal.
Absolutely. Well, thank you both so much again for joining us. And that's all we have time for today. So we're going to wrap up. And before we do, I want to invite everyone to tune in next week, or I'm sorry, in 2 weeks for the Gram. So that will be our next Theorizing the Web Presents. And we want to give a big thank you again to Momi for helping to produce this and for hosting us. So thank you so much. And thank you to everyone who's watching for your insightful questions and for participating. We hope you've enjoyed this time as much as we have, and have a good afternoon.
And thank you, Apryl, for having us and interviewing us.
Of course.
Thanks. Bye, everyone.